You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. What would you do if you were living in Paris in 1949 and Julia Child just happened to be your best friend and neighbor? What then if the two of you just happened to stumble upon a murder? My guest this week is Colleen Cambridge, who also writes under the name Colleen Gleason. Colleen is an award-winning USA Today and New York Times bestselling author whose books have been translated into 8 languages. Colleen is a prolific writer, and her latest book, Mastering the Art of French Murder, is the first in her new An American in Paris mystery series, featuring Tabitha Knight and the aforementioned bestie, Julia Child. Please allow me to introduce Colleen Cambridge, author of Mastering the Art of French Murder. Hello, Colleen. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Jennifer. Happy to be here.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, I have the absolute best job in the world because I write books. I write mostly murder mysteries. I write under different names, Colleen Gleason and also Colleen Cambridge, and I've been doing this since 2007. So I'm very fortunate to be able to do something I love, and I'm very fortunate to be able to have written in a number of different genres and different, topics with different voices and different settings. So it's really, I think it's the best job in the world, and I'm very lucky.
Well, I'm very grateful that you think that because I really loved this book. And so I'm glad that you made it.
Thank you. I just finished the second one in this series. So hopefully that one will go. Everybody will like that one as well. We'll see.
I'm so excited. And no, I mean, when I finished reading this book, I definitely wanted the next.
Oh, good. Thank you.
So I'm excited.
Well, you have to wait a year, but it'll be out in about a year. So
that's the worst thing, though, the patience part of it,
Yeah, I know some people like to wait and then buy or get all the books at one time and read them all together, but you never know how long a series is going to be. I mean, there's always a chance if it doesn't do well enough, the publisher won't do more. Or if people wait till the whole series is out, the publisher doesn't think that there's enough interest, so they might cancel it. So it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, I could see that. Do you have a connection yourself to Paris or to France?
Well, not really, other than the fact that I'm probably, if you look at my genealogy and I haven't done the DNA testing, but if you look at my family history, I have a lot of French ancestors. I'm probably 3/4 French, even though my name, Colleen Gleason, sounds very Irish. I have a lot of French in me, and I've been to Paris twice, and I loved it. Can't wait to go back. Did not get to go there to research this particular book because it was still iffy with COVID when I was writing it and doing the research. So I'm hoping to get back there maybe this fall.
Fun. Yeah, it's always good to have an excuse, like a work-related excuse to go somewhere you really want to go.
For sure.
So can you tell us a little bit about the premise of Mastering the Art of French Murder?
So it's after World War II, Paris has been liberated, and my main character, whose name is Tabitha Knight, who's from the United States, actually a suburb of Detroit, she had worked as a Rosie the Riveter during the war at Willow Run Bomber Plant, which is a personal connection for me because I grew up very close to Willow Run Bomber Plant, or Willow Run Airport, and my grandfather, grandmother, and great aunt, who was named Rosie, worked at Willow Run. So I knew I wanted to write a mystery series set in Paris where Julia Child was a side character, a supporting character. But I needed a reason for a young woman from America to go there. So I think she took the position of, or I think she had the mindset of many young women after the war, many women who had worked in what was called men's work and they no longer needed them. So she was kind of at loose ends. She's not in a place in her life where she's ready to get married, although she was engaged. She doesn't really want to be a teacher, even though that's what she went to school for. And she's about 30. So she knows what she wants. And right now she doesn't want to settle down. But her mother is French, and her grandmother and mother had, raised her with her father and her other sisters. And when her grandmother died, the opportunity to go visit her grandfather, who still lived in Paris, came up, and Tabitha decides to take that opportunity. So she goes to Paris. This is all backstory. She goes to Paris, and who should she meet but a young woman who's also an American expat named Julia Child, who lives across the street from where Tabitha's staying with her grandfather and his friend Uncle Rafe. And Julia and Tabitha become friends because Tabitha's fluent in French, having been raised by a French mother and grandmother. Julia is very much not. She's still at that time in like the end of 1949, not only struggling, but she's still learning the language. And of course, Julia at that time is enrolled in Le Cordon Bleu. And so she's learning all the ways to cook, and she's very good at it. And Tabitha, unfortunately, is not very good at cooking. And so when Grandpa's housekeeper has to leave unexpectedly to go take care of an ailing mom, the evening cooking falls to Tabitha. Now, they have maids that come in during the day, but Tabitha has to do the cooking. So she and Julia have met and they become friends. And that's all the backstory. But one day they go to the market together. When they come back from the market, they walk into Julia's building, and there is a woman freaking out because there's a dead body in the basement. So they go down, they find this dead body. Not only is there a dead body, but Julia Child's chef's knife is sitting next to the body with all sorts of blood on it. Now, spoiler alert, Julia Child did not murder anybody. But of course, it sure looks like that at that time. Or at least she's being a suspect. So that's the setup for this book.
Fabulous. Yes. So I'll start with the most obvious question. Why Julia Child?
Actually, I can't take credit for it. My publisher is the one who came up with the idea. I had written 2 other series for Kensington Books already. One is a series with Abraham Lincoln's aide, Adam Quinn, solving mysteries in Civil War, Washington, D.C. And that actually is written under the name C.M. Gleason. But then I also am currently writing a series with Agatha Christie's housekeeper, solving mysteries in 1930s Devon, England. So that's kind of my brand, kind of my, if you want to say shtick. It's what I seem to do well, or what at least the publisher thinks I do well. Take a historical figure, someone, who's very interesting, and make them a friend or a side character for a protagonist who solves mysteries. Mysteries are very popular. Historical mysteries are popular right now, which I love because I love historical mysteries. And so that's what happened. My publisher was very pleased with the success of the Agatha Christie Housekeeper series, the Philida Bright series. And they said, hey, would you be willing to do this? And I immediately jumped on it because Paris, Julia Child, food, and then I could do whatever I wanted with the protagonist, which is what is attractive to me as a writer. They originally were trying to decide if I should actually write Julia Child as the main character solving mysteries. And as much as I think Julia Child is a national treasure and is very, just an amazing woman, I prefer to have the opportunity to develop my main character the way I want to, rather than have the limitations of what actually happened. So for me, it was a wonderful marriage.
That makes a lot of sense. I enjoy her as the side character. She's sort of like the best friend.
She's the best friend. Yeah, she's the best character. And, she's on page, but she's maybe not on page enough for some people, but she's maybe on page just the right amount for everyone else.
She's there in spirit the whole time. You definitely feel her presence and you feel her influence on Tabitha, even when Tabitha isn't with her.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. And the other reason I developed Tabitha the way I did is they're about the same age. Julia's early 30s, so she's like 33-ish. I think she turns 34 in 1949. I can't remember exactly, but Tabitha's 30. And so the two women, what they have in common is they don't just want to be housewives. They don't just want to be, a woman who, fits into that funnel. And even though Julia and Paul Child had a lovely marriage, very supportive of each other, and she, adored Paul, she didn't want to just be a diplomat's wife. And so there's another connection there between Tabitha and Julia. Interestingly enough, my Agatha Christie series, the Philida Bright series, the main, the sidekick character, I hate to use that term for Agatha Christie because she's really not a sidekick, but, they're also about the same age, and they also have a friendship based on, commonalities. And both Julia and Agatha are a little bit older when they really come into the fame. And I love that there's that connection between those two female celebrities that I've used in these series, because it's just such a really nice serendipity. It just all feels right to me that these older women who are coming into their own in their, 30s, 40s, 50s, for Child, she was 50s. I love being able to write about women like that.
Yeah, I think it's really juicy to see who she is before she comes into her own. And also to see, I mean, we're with Tabitha, she's the main character. And it's so interesting that she's left a world, this Rosie the Riveter world, where she felt very sure of herself. And now she's not so sure where she is or isn't. She still is a woman. She wants to be feminine. She wants to be loved. She wants to find a partner, but she also doesn't want to be pigeonholed.
Yes.
So it's interesting to see this evolution personally, but also like contextually, historically.
Yes, exactly, exactly. She carries around a Swiss Army knife all the time, and she really enjoyed her work as a riveter. And she's got like a mechanical mind. But you're right, she still is a woman, and she still wants to be feminine or, appreciate that feminine side or demonstrate that feminine side, I should say. So that's how many of us are.
Yeah, for sure.
You don't have to be pigeonholed into one or the other. Oh, she's a tomboy. Oh, she doesn't wear lipstick. Oh, she likes to wear great fashion. Oh, she has no idea what to do with a screwdriver. No.
Right. And she's 30 years old, so her life is over if she's not married.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, she's not married. Oops. Sorry for her. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I think in general, but especially the way that you've written her, I can understand why you'd want Julia Child to be your best friend. Were you worried about writing about someone who is so beloved and also so present in our minds? Like, we all know who she is now.
There's always that fear that someone who's a Julia Child expert is going to say, wait a minute, you messed that up. But not really, because there's so much Julia Child I can take. She's got an autobiography, which is the first thing I started reading before I even started to write the book. I looked at that, My Life in France. And then obviously I can watch her on TV. There's obviously the movie Julie and Julia, even though that's fictionalized, Meryl Streep was amazing in it. And then there's the Julia HBO series, which is also so wonderful. I'm just really enjoying watching that as well. So I was a little worried about getting her voice right, the way it, and of course you're not hearing it, you're reading it unless you're listening to the audiobook, which I haven't heard yet, but I understand that the narrator did an amazing job nailing her voice. But I wasn't super worried about Julia. I was very worried when I was writing the Lincoln series because everybody knows everything about Lincoln. There's so many people who know so much about Abraham Lincoln that I was a little worried I would step into something there. And Agatha Christie, obviously people know her work. So I do a lot of Easter eggs of Agatha Christie books and ideas and characters in those books. But she wasn't like a public figure where we heard her speak a lot. She was very shy. So Julia, not so much. She's fun to write, though, because she's super bubbly and you can just hear her. I can hear her voice in my head, when she's in the kitchen, when she's describing it, because I've seen her shows. So, and I've read her book. Her autobiography really helped me get that kind of voice. She's can be very irreverent and bawdy and always enthusiastic, always open-minded, always wanting to learn. So it was a pleasure to write her. It is a pleasure to write her, I should say.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question about the research that you did about her and her family. Was there anything that you discovered that really surprised you about her?
I don't know if there's the fact that she worked for the predecessor of the CIA when she met her husband, Paul. They were working in, at the time it was called Ceylon, now it's Sri Lanka, over in the, on the eastern side of the globe or far east from here. And, there's a lot of question. There's some conjecture as to what exact spy work she did while she was there, and also whether she was in Paris as a spy. I've seen all sides of that, and I don't know, that may end up in a book at some point. We'll see. I don't know if I want to perpetuate something that has absolutely no basis in fact, but I've heard both sides, and I would do some more research on that. So that was very interesting to find out that she had worked for, like I said, the predecessor of the CIA. It was also interesting to me, really, and also comforting to read about her marriage with Paul and how they got together. At first she was sort of interested in him and he was like, not really. Because she's so boisterous and he's so intellectual. But their love story was very true, and their marriage was such it was a very much a give and take. And he was definitely the intellectual and he's so much more serious than she was. Julia was, let it all hang out kind of a thing. And together they maybe physically looked a little mismatched, but I loved reading all about how their relationship was and how he supported her all through their life, especially when she started doing the French Chef. The other interesting thing is that outside of the US, Julia Child isn't really important or noticed she's certainly not as beloved as she is here in the US. So that was kind of a surprise to me to realize she's our national treasure and just not quite as popular as, say, Agatha Christie is outside of the US.
Yeah, that surprises me too. I just think of her as this larger than life American heroine kind of iconic type. Yeah.
Exactly. How can you not love her, especially if you watch any of her old shows? It's just like, oh my gosh, yeah.
Curious about what's going on in Paris right now? My second podcast, Don't Miss This, takes you beyond the typical and the obvious with a weekly roundup of the best of what's happening in Paris each week. Never wonder what you're missing out on again. Listen now to Don't Miss This on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So just from the title alone, I get the sense that we're meant to draw a parallel between this book and Mastering the Art of French Cooking, which Julia's famous for. Does this book have any special meaning to you personally?
Do you mean the cookbook?
Mm-hmm.
You know what? Confession time. I actually never owned Mastering the Art of French Cooking before I started researching this book. I mean, obviously I knew who Julia Child was. You know, I knew enough to be dangerous. I knew who she was, but I hadn't ever used her cookbook, which of course, obviously it's on my shelf now. And I actually go to it. I like to cook. So that's one of the reasons I was ecstatic to do this series. And I'm pretty good at it. I'm a pretty good cook. I mean, I'm not Julia Child. And if I ever were to have her over for dinner, I would not do the cooking. But I'm very good in the kitchen. And so what I do now, because it's always going to be research, is when I'm cooking something different, like I need to make a bechamel sauce, or if I want to make a hollandaise, or if I want to make fish a certain way, I go to her cookbook first instead of doing a quick Google, which is what I used to do. How do you make bechamel sauce? You know, now I go to her cookbook because the thing about her cookbook is they tested and tested and tested and tested all those recipes a bazillion times because she was trying to make it as foolproof as possible. So I know that I'm going to get the foolproof recipe by looking at her book. So I will use that as kind of like an encyclopedia, like a resource. So in that way, that book has become very special to me. And I actually don't eat meat. So a lot of her recipes I would probably not make as they're written, but all the techniques are there. And that's the key. That's what I can get from her book are the techniques, the foundation. You know, she describes how to make a veal roast. And then she says, you could do this with a pork roast, with a beef roast, the same exact thing. All you're doing is swapping out the type of meat. And that's what I really love about her cookbook.
And there is a fair bit of cooking in your book. We don't have any recipes or anything like that, but we do sort of take a few vicarious cooking lessons with Julia via Tabitha.
Yes. That was a discussion that I had with my editor. You know, there was a point in time where my publisher was like, well, are we going to put recipes in the back of the book? Because it's very common in foodie mysteries. You know, you mention something and then you put the recipe in the back of the book. Well, I was like, no way. I mean, how could you have recipes on the back of a book about Julia Child? Like, she's already written the epitome of the recipe. I'm certainly not going to try and put a recipe in there. I mean, that would be so, but instead I felt like what the books do or what the book does is you do get the techniques in her voice. You're getting a cooking lesson. You know, the measurements might not all be there, but if you get the basics of the techniques, and I think hopefully people will find that valuable. She makes omelets in the first book, which she also did on her very ever first TV appearance. When it was just an interview about the cookbook, she made an omelet on TV. So I've made a bunch of omelets over the last couple of years because I was like, well, this is a great technique, you know? And I've had people who read the book tell me, yeah, nice. I went and made omelets based on what you put in the book. So no recipes, but definitely a cooking lesson from Julia.
Yeah, and it is inspirational. It does make you want to try these things. And also admire her dedication. She spends a lot of the book fighting with mayonnaise.
Yeah, that's actually how I got that's why that book was specifically set in December 1949, because that's when Julie was having that mayonnaise problem, where she couldn't figure out why all of a sudden her mayonnaise wasn't working. And I just thought it was kind of, I mean, it's like a paragraph in her biography or autobiography. There's like one paragraph about it. But I thought, well, this could be, I don't want to call it a running joke, but this could be a thread that goes through the book. And I also like being able to use the first line, which was Julia Child had a mayonnaise problem. That was a great, fun first line that popped in my head. I'm like, let's go with this, because then you get right away the mood, I think, of the book. Even though it's a murder mystery, it's what we call a cozy mystery. So there's no gratuitous violence. You know, the violence happens off stage. It's not, you know, very gritty. It's a light, you know, fun, I hope.
Murder light.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's like Murder, She Wrote. You know, you don't get too much of the darkness there, you know, so.
Yeah, exactly. So speaking of murder mysteries, is this a genre you've always been drawn to? Is this what you read when you were a kid?
Totally. Yeah, I grew up reading Nancy Drew, Trixie Belden, all of those, Cherry Ames, all those. And then when I exhausted those, I went on to Agatha Christie as I got older. So that's one of the reasons I was excited to write the Agatha Christie series too. Mysteries have always been probably my favorite genre to read. I love romance novels as well. So what I love is marrying the mystery with the romance. And I always love history. So historical mystery, that genre is my kind of like my holy grail, because you have the mystery, which I love. You have the historical setting, which is always, I just love the historical settings because you learn so much. And then you've got, in most series, and always in mine, you have this slow burn, I call romancers, slow burn relationship between the main protagonist and some other key person in the series. And you get to see how they learn to work together and, respect each other, and eventually probably will get together in some way. So I love that marriage. And I didn't even discover historical mysteries till maybe 10 years ago. And it was C.S. Harris's series. It's the Sebastian St. Cyr series, CYR. Set in Regency England is a very kind of a dark, gritty series, but really, really good. And I love it. Anyway, so that was my introduction to historical mystery, and I haven't looked back. So I'm very delighted to be writing 3 series in that genre.
Fabulous. And when you're structuring a book like this, do you start with the murder or start with the place or the solution and then work your way back?
I usually have a murder in mind. So and I think a lot about murders, and makes my husband a little nervous sometimes. but I think about the murder usually. I usually think about so once I get, well into a series, obviously the place and time are set for me. But for example, I'm getting ready to start the 4th Agatha Christie Philida Bright series, and the other 3 had taken place in this small English town. But now they're going to be in London. So now I'm thinking about, okay, the setting's going to change slightly, but what's the death going to be? So I'm generally starting with how the body is found or how they died. And then I usually build around from there. And I rarely know who done it when I start writing a mystery. It's very rare for me to know that. And even if I do know it, most of the time I change it as I'm working through the story. The exception would be the book I just finished, which is the second Tabitha Knight book. I knew who it was from the beginning, which is shocking, and it never changed. So in a book that I'm coming out at the end of August, however, I kind of knew who the killer was very early on, but I changed the victim twice. So I wrote the murder scene 3 times, basically. It was ugly. But then once I got the murder scene done correctly, then I was able to move on. So that's my long-winded way of saying I don't plot my books out ahead of time. I just kind of go. And the reason I think that works for me is because I love to read mysteries. So for me, I'm reading it as I'm writing it, and I'm following the clues as the protagonist is following the clues. And so that's enjoyable for me. That's what makes writing enjoyable. If I plot everything out ahead of time, it's boring for me. I have a lot of friends who plot their mysteries out, but I don't.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see if you already know the answer, then why bother writing it? Because you already know the answer.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I get that. Colleen has asked me to read a little bit from Mastering the Art of French Murder, so I'm going to read from chapter 1. During the war, I channeled my energies into working at the Willow Run bomber plant, helping to build the B-24 Liberator planes. I'd even learned how to work on their engines. I'd always been a bit of a tomboy, to the dismay of my very ladylike French mother and grandmother. Although I carried lipstick and a comb in my purse, I also always had a Swiss Army knife in my pocket. I liked to tinker with things like machinery and engines. I was always curious about how machines worked and what made people tick. In fact, that was partly how Julia and I had become such close friends. One day, last summer, when we ran into each other at the market, she mentioned that their radio wasn't working properly. I had my handy tool knife with me, of course, so I offered to try to fix it. She was so grateful when I did, and when I wouldn't accept any payment for the work, she insisted I stay for dinner. I had never had such good food outside of a restaurant, and that was when I realized I needed to learn how to cook. If I could fix an airplane engine, I could roast a chicken. It couldn't be that difficult, could it? Yes, it could. The fact that Julia and I lived on the same block and had both recently moved to Paris from the States made it seem like our friendship was meant to be. Not that it was difficult for Julia Child to make friends, but I was a little less outgoing than my boisterous, enthusiastic friend. And since at that time I didn't know anyone in Paris besides my grandfather and Oncle Raph, I had truly enjoyed getting to know Julia, her husband Paul, and Julia's younger sister Dorothy, who'd come to live with them a few months ago. I just worry that this is a harbinger of worse things to come. What's going to be next? Julie was saying in her dramatic fashion as we walked along the curved path of Place du Palais Bourbon toward the market. What if my pie crusts refuse to flake, or my cake icing starts to run all over? What if my soufflés start to fall as hard as the Roman Empire? What will I do? Cooking has become my life. Maybe you should just start at the beginning, I suggested, looking up at her. Julia was 6 feet 2 inches tall and sturdily built, and I'm just a hair under 5 feet 5 inches. My slender build and average stature has always caused comment when I mention that I've worked on airplanes, although I'm not exactly sure why. I didn't have to lift them or anything. When I'm trying to figure out why something isn't working, I take the whole mechanism apart, piece by piece, and check every part one by one. I make sure each piece is working properly and isn't damaged before I move on and put things back together. Maybe you should try that. Why, that makes complete sense, Tabitha, Julia said, stopping abruptly on the sidewalk. She sounded as if I had handed her the key to immortal life. That's how Chef Brunard has been teaching us at Le Cordon Bleu, to start from the very beginning and master each step before moving on. So that's what I'll do. I'll go back to the very basics of mayonnaise making. I'll make notes, I'll experiment, I'll make vats and more vats of mayonnaise until I figure out what's wrong, and I fix it. There's just one thing, I said as the market on Rue de Bourgogne came into view. What's that? She asked with a frown. You're going to need a lot more eggs. We both roared with laughter so hard we staggered like drunks along the street. So you've mentioned a little bit, but can you tell us a little bit more about what's next for you? What are you working on at the moment?
Yeah, so I will have the third book in my Fill It a Bright series. It's called Murder by Invitation Only. It's an homage to Christie's A Murder is Announced. So it's the third book in that series with Fill It a Bright and Agatha Christie's housekeeper. I just finished writing the second American in Paris mystery with Tabitha and Julia. That will come out a year from now. So that'll be like May 2024. And that one is, oh my gosh, I had so much fun with that because it's all about how the Parisians and the French in general hid their wine when the Nazis came in and occupied Paris. I mean, that's kind of the underscore of the whole book. And we spend a lot of time in the catacombs in that book also. So that was really fun to write and just had a blast with it. So, and then we'll see what happens after that.
Fabulous. And so where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with what you're doing, what's going on?
Well, I'm on Facebook as Colleen Cambridge, and you can also get me through my website at either ColleenCambridge.com or ColleenGleason.com. They both go to the same location. So I'm pretty easy to find.
Perfect. And I'll include links to everything so people can find you really easily.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colleen. It was so wonderful speaking to you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you again to Colleen Cambridge for such a fun conversation. You can find Colleen on Instagram and Twitter at Colleen Gleason, on Facebook at Colleen Gleason Author, and on her website, colleengleason.com. Please join me next week when I'll be speaking with New York Times bestselling author Martha Hall Kelly about her book, The Golden Doves. Check back to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book. Thank you for listening to Storytime in Paris. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to rate and review it wherever you listen to podcasts. This is the fastest and easiest way to help the podcast grow, which will help me attract more great authors to bring to you. Please also spread the word to all the people you know who also love to read. If you'd like to go even deeper, join our book club over on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio, where I invite authors who have been on the podcast to come speak with us about their books and delve even deeper into the secrets we couldn't spoil on the podcast. Thank you again, and happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.